Picture this. You're a servant in the palace of Versailles in 1682, carrying a silver basin filled with lukewarm water, scented with rose petals. Your hands tremble as you approach the Sun King himself, Louis XIV, for what the French court calls his morning ablutions. But as you draw closer to the most powerful monarch in Europe, something hits you that makes your stomach turn. A smell so overpowering, so putrid, that you have to fight the urge to retch right there in the royal bedchamber. The man who commands armies, who builds monuments that will last centuries, who dictates fashion to every court in Europe, hasn't had a proper bath in months. His silk stockings are stained with bodily fluids, his powdered wig crawls with lice, and the rouge on his cheeks can't mask the sores that mark his unwashed skin. Yet here you are, about to participate in a bathing ritual so elaborate, so theatrical, that it involves dozens of courtiers and takes the better part of a morning, all while accomplishing absolutely nothing in terms of actual cleanliness. Welcome to the shocking reality of how history's most powerful people actually lived behind their glittering facades. Before diving into these forgotten truths about the ancient elite, if you enjoyed learning about the hidden realities of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient secrets together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the past. What you're about to discover will completely shatter everything you thought you knew about historical hygiene and luxury. These aren't just quirky stories about people who lived differently. These are revelations about systematic practices so bizarre, so unsanitary, that they make modern college dormitories look like operating rooms. We're talking about emperors who believed water would kill them, queens who used human waste as beauty treatments, and nobles who spent fortunes on perfumes not to smell good, but to mask the stench of their rotting bodies. The ancient elite didn't just have different bathing habits, they had bathing habits that would horrify even the most lenient health inspector today. And the most disturbing part? They thought they were being sophisticated, refined, and medically responsible. The same people who built the pyramids, conquered continents, and created art that still moves us to tears were also walking around covered in layers of grime, so thick you could scrape it off with a knife. But here's where it gets really twisted. Their bathing rituals weren't random acts of negligence. They were carefully constructed systems of belief, status, and power that determined who lived and who died, who ruled and who served, who was considered civilized, and who was branded a barbarian. Every drop of water, every grain of soap, every moment spent in or out of a bath carried political, religious, and social meaning that could topple governments or start wars. Let me paint you a picture of what we're really dealing with here. Imagine walking into the throne room of one of history's most celebrated monarchs and being hit by a wall of stench so powerful that visiting diplomats regularly fainted during audiences. Picture nobles whose idea of a bath involved having servants rub them down with perfumed cloths while they remained fully clothed, never allowing actual water to touch their skin for years at a time. Envision beauty treatments that involved smearing fresh dung across the face, drinking urine as a health tonic, and using mercury-based cosmetics that slowly poisoned the wearer into madness. These weren't desperate measures during times of war or famine. These were the preferred practices of people with unlimited resources, the finest physicians money could buy, and access to every luxury their civilizations could produce. They chose to live this way because they believed it made them superior to common people who, ironically, were often significantly cleaner than their rulers. The rabbit hole goes deeper than you can possibly imagine. We're going to explore civilizations where bathing was considered a sign of moral weakness, where clean people were literally outlawed, and where the wealthy paid enormous sums for the privilege of wallowing in their own filth, while convinced they were achieving the height of sophistication. We'll meet emperors who died from infections caused by their refusal to wash, queens whose beauty regimens involved substances so toxic they're now classified as chemical weapons, and entire royal courts that functioned as walking biological disasters. But this isn't just about pointing and laughing at historical figures who made poor hygiene choices. This is about understanding how power, culture, and belief systems can create practices so divorced from reality that they become actively self-destructive. These bathing habits reveal something profound about human nature: how we can convince ourselves that obviously harmful behaviors are actually beneficial when they're wrapped in the right cultural packaging. The ancient elite's relationship with cleanliness exposes the terrifying truth about how easily societies can normalize the abnormal, celebrate the dangerous, and turn survival instincts completely upside down. When you have enough power and wealth, apparently, you can even convince yourself that dirt is divine and disease is dignified. What makes these stories particularly haunting is how they mirror patterns we see throughout history. And even today, the same psychological mechanisms that convinced Roman emperors to avoid baths because water was supposedly weakening are still operating in modern societies, just with different substances and different justifications. The human capacity for self-deception in service of status and power appears to be eternal. As we journey through these shocking revelations about historical hygiene, you'll discover that the most powerful people in history weren't just dirty. They were systematically, religiously, philosophically committed to staying dirty. And they built entire civilizations around this commitment, creating systems of knowledge, medicine, and culture that supported their bizarre relationship with cleanliness. We're going to start our exploration in ancient Rome, where the very people who built the most sophisticated bathing infrastructure in human history also developed some of the most counterintuitive ideas about when and how to use it. Then we'll travel to medieval Europe, where Christian theology transformed bathing from a luxury into a sin, creating centuries of systematic filth among the ruling classes. From there, we'll examine the Renaissance courts where appearance mattered more than reality, leading to cosmetic practices that were literally lethal. But first, let me give you a preview of just how extreme these practices could get. In the court of Elizabeth I, widely considered one of history's most successful monarchs, courtiers would go months without changing their undergarments because the queen believed that frequent washing weakened the body's natural defenses. The same woman who defeated the Spanish Armada and ushered in England's golden age also had teeth so blackened by decay and breath so foul that foreign ambassadors mentioned it in their official reports home. Or consider the Palace of Versailles during its height under Louis XIV, the most magnificent royal residence ever constructed, a monument to human artistic achievement and architectural brilliance, was also a cesspit of human waste and body odor that visitors could smell from miles away. The gardens that still attract millions of tourists were originally designed not just for beauty, but to provide places where courtiers could relieve themselves, since the palace had virtually no functional sanitation systems. These weren't accidents or oversights. They were the inevitable results of belief systems that prioritized image over substance, tradition over innovation, and social status over basic human health. The ancient elite didn't fail to stay clean despite their wealth and power. They stayed dirty because of their wealth and power, because cleanliness was associated with the lower classes and they needed to distinguish themselves from common people in every possible way. The medical theories that supported these practices would be hilarious if they weren't so deadly. Court physicians with the finest educations available taught that water opened the pores and allowed evil spirits to enter the body, that soap stripped away protective oils that prevented disease, and that the natural odors of the human body were actually signs of internal health and spiritual purity. These same physicians prescribed treatments that involved deliberately introducing foreign substances into open wounds, drinking mercury-based potions, and applying paste made from heavy metals directly to the skin. The most educated medical minds of their time were systematically poisoning their patients while convincing them that cleanliness was dangerous. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of these historical bathing habits is how they were used as tools of political control and social manipulation. Cleanliness became a marker of class distinction, with different rules for different social levels. The ability to remain dirty while surrounded by luxury became a privilege reserved for the highest ranks of society, while lower classes were actually required to maintain higher standards of hygiene as part of their service duties. Kings and queens, who couldn't be bothered to wash their own bodies, would demand that their servants be spotlessly clean, creating a bizarre inversion where the people with the least resources were held to higher cleanliness standards than those with unlimited wealth. This wasn't hypocrisy. It was a deliberate system designed to reinforce social hierarchies through the most intimate aspects of daily life. The economic implications of these practices were staggering. Entire industries developed around the elite's refusal to bathe properly, creating markets for perfumes, cosmetics, and clothing, designed to disguise rather than address the underlying problems. Fortunes were made selling solutions to problems that could have been solved with soap and water, but couldn't be because soap and water were considered beneath the dignity of the ruling class. As we dive deeper into these shocking revelations about historical hygiene, you'll discover that the ancient elite's bathing habits weren't just personal choices. They were complex systems of belief and practice that shaped entire civilizations. The consequences of these choices rippled through every aspect of society, influencing everything from architecture to warfare, from religion to international diplomacy. The story we're about to tell isn't just about dirty people in fancy clothes. It's about how human societies can create elaborate justifications for obviously harmful behaviors, how power can insulate people from the consequences of their choices, and how cultural norms can override basic survival instincts. These historical bathing habits reveal truths about human nature that are as relevant today as they were centuries ago, and the lessons they teach us about power, culture, and self-deception are more important now than ever. So, prepare yourself for a journey through some of the most bizarre, disgusting, and enlightening chapters in human history, where we'll discover that the people we've been taught to admire were often walking biological disasters, and where we'll learn that sometimes the most shocking truths about the past can help us understand the present in ways we never expected. The systematic filth of ancient Rome represents one of history's greatest paradoxes. Here was a civilization that constructed aqueducts spanning hundreds of miles, engineered public baths that could accommodate thousands of people simultaneously, and developed sewage systems so advanced that some are still functional today. Yet the very emperors who commissioned these marvels of sanitation engineering often refused to use them, convinced that their divine status elevated them above such mundane concerns as personal cleanliness. Take Emperor Commodus, the man who believed he was the reincarnation of Hercules and spent his days fighting gladiators in the arena while Rome crumbled around him. His personal bathing routine was a spectacle of imperial madness that perfectly encapsulated the Roman elite's twisted relationship with hygiene. Rather than simply bathing like a normal person, Commodus insisted on elaborate ceremonies where slaves would pour perfumed oils over his unwashed body while he remained standing, never allowing the liquid to actually cleanse his skin. The emperor's reasoning was as deranged as it was dangerous. He believed that sitting or lying down during ablutions would make him vulnerable to assassination, that water touching his skin directly would dilute his divine essence, and that soap was a poison designed by his enemies to weaken his connection to the gods. So instead of bathing, Commodus would have his servants coat him in layers of scented oils and powders, creating a grotesque mask that barely concealed the rotting flesh beneath. But Commodus wasn't an anomaly. He was following a tradition established by earlier emperors who had turned the avoidance of proper hygiene into an art form. Emperor Caligula, whose name has become synonymous with madness and excess, maintained a personal grooming routine that involved having his entire body rubbed down with exotic spices and precious stones while he lay naked on a bed of rose petals. The process took hours and accomplished nothing except creating a human parfum that masked the stench of his unwashed skin. The spices weren't chosen randomly. They were specifically selected for their ability to preserve dead flesh, because Caligula believed his body was already transitioning into divine form and needed to be maintained like a holy relic. Court physicians who dared to suggest actual washing were executed for treason, accused of trying to interfere with the emperor's transformation into a god. What makes these practices even more disturbing is how they were justified by the finest medical minds of the Roman Empire. The personal physician to Marcus Aurelius, one of Rome's most celebrated philosophical emperors, wrote extensive treatises explaining why frequent bathing was medically dangerous for people of imperial blood. According to these learned doctors, the divine essence that flowed through royal veins was water-soluble and would literally drain away if exposed to too much moisture. This medical theory led to bathing practices that were not just ineffective but actively harmful. Instead of water, Roman nobles would cleanse themselves with wine, believing that alcohol would purify their skin without diluting their divine essence. The wine would be heated to body temperature and applied with silk cloths, but never in quantities sufficient to actually remove dirt or bacteria. The result was skin that was simultaneously sticky from dried wine residue and grimy from accumulated filth, a perfect breeding ground for the infections that killed many Roman aristocrats. The wine bathing ritual became so elaborate that it required an entire staff of specialized servants. There were wine tasters who would sample each batch to ensure it was worthy of imperial skin, wine warmers who maintained the perfect temperature using heated stones, and wine appliers who had trained for years to master the precise technique of cloth application that would cleanse without actually cleaning. These servants were required to maintain standards of cleanliness that their masters refused to achieve themselves. They had to bathe daily in hot water with harsh soaps, scrubbing their skin until it was raw to ensure they wouldn't contaminate their filthy employers with foreign dirt. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Servants were punished for being dirty while serving masters who were systematically filthier than the poorest beggars in Rome's streets. But the Roman elite's aversion to proper bathing extended beyond mere personal preference into the realm of political philosophy. Clean people were considered morally suspect, too concerned with earthly pleasures to focus on higher spiritual matters. Senators who appeared too well-groomed faced accusations of effeminacy and foreign influence, while those who embraced strategic filthiness were praised for their masculine virtues and Roman authenticity. This created a bizarre competition among the aristocracy to see who could achieve the most sophisticated form of dirtiness. Wealthy Romans would spend fortunes on rare perfumes and exotic oils, not to smell pleasant, but to create signature odors that would distinguish their particular brand of filth from everyone else's. A senator's personal scent became as recognizable as his family name, and olfactory experts could identify political alliances and social hierarchies simply by analyzing the complex bouquet of smells emanating from different aristocratic factions. The perfume industry that developed around this systematic avoidance of cleanliness became one of Rome's most profitable enterprises. Master perfumers commanded salaries higher than military generals, and their workshops were guarded like state secrets because the formulas for masking human decay were considered matters of national security. A politician's perfumer could make or break careers by creating scent profiles that enhanced rather than disguised their clients' natural odors. The most successful perfumes weren't designed to smell good in the conventional sense. They were engineered to smell expensive, complex, and deliberately artificial. The goal was to create an olfactory signature so obviously constructed and costly that it would immediately communicate the wearer's wealth and status to anyone within smelling distance. Natural human odors, no matter how pungent, were considered more authentic and therefore more aristocratic than artificial cleanliness. This philosophy extended to the famous Roman baths, which became less about bathing and more about political theater. The wealthy would arrive at the baths not to get clean, but to display their elaborate avoidance of actual cleanliness. They would spend hours in the complex, moving from room to room in ceremonial processions, but never actually entering the water. Instead, they would have servants splash small amounts of bathwater on their clothed bodies, while they remained standing on elevated platforms, demonstrating their participation in bathing culture while avoiding the vulgar reality of getting wet. The architectural design of Roman baths was modified to accommodate this theatrical approach to hygiene. Special viewing areas were constructed where the elite could observe the bathing process without participating, and elevated walkways allowed them to tour the facilities while remaining literally above the water. The most expensive sections of the baths were the areas furthest from the actual bathing pools, where aristocrats could socialize and conduct business while maintaining their carefully cultivated filthiness. Roman engineers, the same brilliant minds who constructed roads and aqueducts that lasted centuries, were commissioned to design elaborate systems for avoiding water contact. They created steam chambers where nobles could experience the heat and humidity of bathing without the cleansing effects, and developed techniques for applying oils and perfumes that would give the appearance of post-bath grooming without the inconvenience of actual washing. The medical establishment supported these practices with increasingly elaborate theories about the dangers of excessive cleanliness. Court physicians taught that the human body produced natural oils and secretions that were essential for health, and that washing these substances away would leave the skin vulnerable to disease and evil influences. They prescribed specific schedules for limited washing, perhaps once per month for the hands and face, but never for the entire body, which they claimed would cause immediate death from shock. These same physicians recommended treatments that involved deliberately introducing foreign substances into the body through unwashed skin. They believed that the accumulated grime and oils on unwashed flesh would filter and purify medicines, making them more effective than if applied to clean skin. Patients were instructed to avoid washing for weeks before medical procedures to ensure their natural protective coating was at full strength. The result was a ruling class that was systematically poisoning itself, while convinced it was achieving the height of medical sophistication. Roman aristocrats suffered from skin diseases, respiratory infections, and parasitic infestations at rates that would have been shocking in the poorest neighborhoods. But these conditions were interpreted as signs of spiritual refinement rather than basic hygiene failures. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Roman bathing culture was how it was used to reinforce social hierarchies and political control. Access to actual cleanliness became a privilege reserved for the lower classes, while the right to remain dirty was a marker of elite status. Slaves and servants were required to maintain standards of hygiene that their masters proudly rejected, creating a world where cleanliness was literally a sign of social inferiority. This inversion of normal hygiene standards wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate tool of social control that reinforced the Roman class system in the most intimate aspects of daily life. By making dirtiness a privilege and cleanliness a burden, the aristocracy created a system where rebellion against social norms would require embracing the very thing that marked someone as lower class. A clean aristocrat was immediately suspect, assumed to be either a foreign agent or someone with dangerous democratic sympathies who refused to accept their proper place in the social hierarchy. The consequences of this systematic filth were as predictable as they were devastating. Roman aristocrats died from diseases that could have been prevented with soap and water, but their deaths were celebrated as martyrdom to higher principles. When Emperor Claudius succumbed to what was almost certainly a bacterial infection caused by his refusal to wash properly, court historians praised his dedication to maintaining the divine essence that common cleanliness would have corrupted. The infection that killed Claudius began as a small cut on his unwashed hand that became infected because he refused to clean the wound. His physicians, following established medical doctrine, treated the infection by applying more dirt and oils to the affected area, believing that foreign contamination required native contamination to achieve balance. As the infection spread up his arm, turning his skin black and filling his blood with poison, the medical establishment doubled down on their theories, prescribing increasingly elaborate applications of filth-based remedies. Claudius spent his final weeks in agony, his body consumed by an infection that could have been stopped with basic hygiene, while his physicians praised his suffering as evidence of his spiritual superiority. They interpreted his fever as divine fire purifying his soul, his delirium as prophetic visions, and his eventual death as a triumphant ascension to godhood rather than the preventable medical disaster it actually was. But the Roman approach to avoiding cleanliness reached its most grotesque expression during the reign of Emperor Elagabalus, whose bathing rituals combined religious mania with medical ignorance in ways that horrified even his jaded contemporaries. Elagabalus believed that his body was a temple housing a Syrian sun god, and that any attempt to clean this temple would constitute sacrilege punishable by divine wrath. Instead of bathing, Elagabalus would have his servants cover his entire body with a mixture of honey, crushed pearls, and the blood of sacrificed animals, creating a sticky coating that attracted insects and bacteria while supposedly attracting divine favor. This grotesque mixture would be applied daily but never removed, creating layers of accumulated filth that built up over months until his skin was barely visible beneath the crusted residue. The emperor's appearance became so disturbing that even his closest advisors struggled to remain in his presence for extended periods. Foreign ambassadors reported that meetings with Elagabalus had to be conducted from across large rooms because the smell emanating from his coated body was literally unbearable at close range. Yet the emperor interpreted these reactions as evidence of his divine power, believing that mortals were overwhelmed by proximity to godhood rather than repulsed by his systematic self-neglect. Elagabalus took his anti-bathing philosophies so seriously that he outlawed soap throughout the Roman Empire, declaring it a foreign poison designed to weaken Roman virtue. Citizens caught with soap faced imprisonment, while those who continued bathing regularly were branded as traitors and enemies of the state. The emperor's personal guard was instructed to arrest anyone who appeared too clean, operating under the assumption that excessive hygiene indicated foreign allegiance or revolutionary sympathies. The soap prohibition created a thriving black market where Roman citizens paid enormous sums for smuggled cleaning supplies, risking their lives for the privilege of basic hygiene. Underground bathing houses operated in secret, hidden in the basements of private homes, where people could wash without being detected by imperial agents. These illegal bathing operations were raided regularly, with participants facing punishments ranging from heavy fines to execution depending on how clean they had managed to become. The economic impact of the soap prohibition was catastrophic for Roman trade networks that had developed around hygiene products. Entire industries collapsed overnight as merchants found themselves unable to sell products that had been legal and profitable for centuries. The resulting unemployment and economic disruption contributed to social unrest that eventually played a role in Elagabalus's assassination, though his death was officially attributed to political rather than hygienic causes. Even after Elagabalus's death, the cultural damage from his anti-cleanliness campaigns lingered for generations. Romans had become so accustomed to associating dirt with virtue that returning to normal bathing practices felt like moral regression. Subsequent emperors had to carefully navigate the political implications of hygiene policy, balancing public health concerns against the established tradition of aristocratic filthiness that had become deeply embedded in Roman culture. The transition away from systematic filth was complicated by medical theories that had evolved to support dirty practices. Physicians who had spent years developing treatments based on the assumption that cleanliness was dangerous couldn't simply reverse their positions without admitting that their previous recommendations had been killing patients. Instead, they developed increasingly complex theories about gradual cleansing that would allow the body to slowly adapt to the shock of being clean. These gradual cleansing protocols could take years to complete and required constant medical supervision to ensure that patients didn't cleanse themselves too quickly and die from hygiene shock. Wealthy Romans would spend fortunes on supervised bathing programs that involved incrementally reducing their dirt levels over months or years, with physicians monitoring their vital signs to ensure they could survive each stage of the cleaning process. But the most lasting legacy of Roman anti-bathing culture wasn't medical or economic, it was psychological. The association between dirt and status had become so deeply ingrained in Roman aristocratic identity that many nobles genuinely couldn't conceive of themselves as clean people. Their self-image was built around strategic filthiness, and removing that filth felt like removing their identity itself. This psychological attachment to dirt created a form of hygiene dysmorphia where clean Romans felt exposed and vulnerable, convinced that their washed skin made them appear common and unworthy of respect. They would apply artificial dirt and oils immediately after bathing to restore their sense of aristocratic authenticity, defeating the purpose of washing while maintaining the ritual of cleanliness that social pressure demanded. The Roman bathing houses that survived the anti-cleanliness campaigns had to develop entirely new business models to accommodate customers who wanted to appear to bathe without actually becoming clean. They created elaborate theatrical productions where clients could participate in bathing ceremonies that involved all the social aspects of communal washing without the hygienic results. These performances became popular forms of entertainment, where Romans could experience nostalgia for cleanliness while maintaining their commitment to aristocratic filthiness. As the Roman Empire began its long decline, historians would later point to the systematic abandonment of hygiene among the ruling class as both a symptom and a cause of imperial decay. The same civilization that had conquered the known world through discipline and organization had convinced itself that basic sanitation was beneath its dignity, creating a leadership class so divorced from reality that they couldn't recognize their own deterioration. The barbarian tribes that eventually overran Rome were often significantly cleaner than the Romans they conquered, a fact that Roman historians struggled to explain within their existing frameworks of civilization and savagery. How could unwashed Romans represent civilization, while clean barbarians represented chaos? The cognitive dissonance was so severe that many Roman chroniclers simply refused to acknowledge the hygiene disparity, maintaining the fiction of Roman cleanliness superiority even as they documented their own systematic filthiness. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of Roman bathing culture was how it influenced subsequent civilizations that looked to Rome as a model of sophistication and power. The systematic avoidance of hygiene that had developed as a marker of Roman aristocratic status was exported throughout the empire and beyond, creating traditions of elite filthiness that would persist for centuries after Rome itself had fallen. Medieval European courts would adopt Roman anti-bathing practices without understanding their original context, creating new justifications for old habits that made even less sense than their predecessors. Christian theology would be twisted to support hygiene avoidance that had originally been justified by pagan religious beliefs, demonstrating how flexible human reasoning can become when it serves established power structures. The Roman legacy of strategic filthiness would echo through European history for over 1,000 years, influencing everything from medical practice to social etiquette to architectural design. The bathhouses that Romans had built throughout their empire would fall into disuse, not because they were destroyed by barbarians, but because the populations that inherited them had also inherited the Roman belief that using them was socially and spiritually dangerous. The Christian transformation of bathing from luxury to sin represents one of history's most successful campaigns of systematic misinformation, where religious authorities convinced entire populations that cleanliness was not just unnecessary but actively evil. What began as Roman aristocratic pretension evolved into medieval Christian doctrine, creating centuries of institutionalized filth that would make the dirtiest Roman emperor look like a hygiene enthusiast by comparison. The early Christian church faced a unique challenge when it came to hygiene. Roman bathing culture was deeply associated with pagan rituals, social hierarchy, and bodily pleasure, all things that Christian theologians wanted to distance themselves from. But rather than simply rejecting Roman bathing practices, church leaders went much further, declaring that cleanliness itself was a form of vanity that distracted from spiritual concerns and demonstrated dangerous attachment to worldly pleasures. Saint Jerome, one of the most influential early Christian writers, established the theological foundation for medieval Europe's war against hygiene, when he proclaimed that washing the body was equivalent to washing away the protective layer of holy dirt that accumulated through righteous living. According to Jerome's teachings, truly devout Christians should embrace physical filth as evidence of their spiritual purity, while those who maintained clean bodies were revealing their corrupt priorities and insufficient faith. This wasn't just abstract theological speculation. It became practical policy that shaped the daily lives of millions of Europeans for centuries. Monasteries, which served as centers of learning and medical knowledge throughout the medieval period, actively prohibited bathing among their residents. Monks and nuns who were caught washing themselves faced severe punishments including public flogging, extended fasting, and expulsion from their religious communities. The monastic approach to hygiene was so extreme that it would have shocked even the filthiest Roman aristocrats. While Romans had at least maintained elaborate rituals around their avoidance of cleanliness, medieval monasteries simply forbade washing entirely. Monks were expected to wear the same robes for months or years without cleaning them, allowing the fabric to become so saturated with bodily fluids and accumulated grime that the garments could literally stand upright when removed from their wearers' bodies. But the church's anti-bathing campaign wasn't limited to religious communities. It extended into every aspect of medieval society through a sophisticated network of theological justification and social pressure. Parish priests were instructed to preach against the dangers of excessive cleanliness, warning their congregations that people who bathed regularly were opening themselves to demonic possession, moral corruption, and eternal damnation. The medical establishment, such as it was in medieval Europe, enthusiastically supported these religious prohibitions with their own twisted theories about the dangers of water contact. Medieval physicians taught that the human body contained four essential humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that washing disrupted the delicate balance between these substances, leading to immediate illness and eventual death. According to medieval medical theory, the accumulated dirt and oils on unwashed skin formed a protective barrier that prevented the humors from escaping the body and foreign influences from entering. Washing away this protective coating was considered medical malpractice, and physicians who recommended bathing for their patients faced accusations of incompetence or deliberate harm. The most respected medical authorities of the medieval period prescribed treatments that involved applying additional dirt and refuse to patients' bodies, believing that external filth would strengthen internal health. This medical support for a systematic filthiness wasn't based on observation or evidence. It was pure theoretical speculation designed to align with religious doctrine. Medieval physicians had no understanding of bacteria, infection, or disease transmission, so they created elaborate explanations for phenomena they couldn't observe. When patients who bathed regularly appeared healthier than those who avoided washing, medieval doctors attributed this to temporary demonic influence that would eventually result in spiritual corruption and physical collapse. The combination of religious prohibition and medical endorsement created a perfect storm of systematic uncleanliness that reached its peak during the reign of medieval European monarchs, who turned their refusal to bathe into elaborate displays of piety and medical sophistication. These rulers didn't just avoid washing. They created court ceremonies around their commitment to holy filthiness that made Roman emperor rituals look simple by comparison. Consider the court of Charlemagne, the so-called father of Europe, whose personal hygiene practices were so revolting that even medieval chroniclers struggled to describe them diplomatically. Charlemagne believed that washing his body would interfere with his divine right to rule, since God had apparently chosen him to lead precisely because of his willingness to embrace physical corruption as evidence of spiritual strength. The emperor's daily routine involved having servants scrape visible dirt and debris from his skin using metal implements, but never with water or soap, which were considered too cleansing for imperial flesh. The scraped-off material was collected in golden bowls and distributed to courtiers as holy relics, since anything that had been in contact with the emperor's unwashed body was believed to possess miraculous healing properties. Charlemagne's refusal to wash became so legendary that foreign diplomats would arrive at his court with perfumed cloths pressed against their faces, and even then many would faint during audiences from the overwhelming stench. The emperor interpreted these reactions as evidence of his divine power, believing that mortals were overwhelmed by proximity to God's chosen representative, rather than repulsed by the accumulated filth of years without bathing. The imperial wardrobe reflected this commitment to systematic dirtiness in ways that would have impressed even the most degenerate Roman aristocrats. Charlemagne's robes were never cleaned, only replaced when they became so saturated with bodily fluids that they began falling apart. The discarded garments were preserved as religious artifacts and distributed to churches throughout the empire, where they were displayed as evidence of imperial holiness and venerated by pilgrims who believed that proximity to the emperor's filthy clothing would cure their ailments. But Charlemagne's approach to avoiding hygiene was relatively straightforward compared to the elaborate anti-bathing rituals developed by later medieval monarchs who turned the rejection of cleanliness into high art. King Louis VII of France created a court position specifically dedicated to monitoring his personal filthiness levels, employing a master of imperial uncleanliness whose job was to ensure that the king maintained optimal dirt accumulation without accidentally becoming clean through normal daily activities. The master of imperial uncleanliness was one of the highest-ranking positions in the French court, requiring extensive training in the theological and medical principles that supported royal filthiness. This official would examine the king's body daily, measuring dirt levels, analyzing odor intensity, and recommending adjustments to ensure that Louis maintained the perfect balance of corruption that demonstrated both piety and royal authority. The position came with an extensive staff of assistant dirt monitors who specialized in different aspects of imperial uncleanliness. There were experts in measuring skin oil accumulation, specialists in cataloging different types of bodily odors, and technicians who maintained the complex equipment used to apply additional filth when natural accumulation was insufficient. The entire operation resembled a reverse spa, dedicated to achieving maximum dirtiness through scientific precision. Louis VII's commitment to systematic filthiness was so extreme that he required his entire court to maintain similar standards of uncleanliness as a demonstration of loyalty and shared values. Courtiers who appeared too clean faced accusations of disloyalty, foreign influence, or insufficient faith, while those who achieved particularly impressive levels of accumulated grime were rewarded with titles, land grants, and marriage opportunities. This created a competitive environment where French nobles vied with each other to achieve the most sophisticated forms of dirtiness, spending enormous sums on rare substances that would enhance their natural odors and create signature scent profiles that would distinguish them from their rivals. The perfume industry that developed around this competition was completely different from its Roman predecessor. Instead of masking unpleasant odors, medieval perfumes were designed to enhance and amplify natural body smells, creating complex olfactory experiences that communicated wealth, status, and religious devotion simultaneously. The most expensive perfumes weren't designed to smell pleasant, but to smell holy, incorporating ingredients that were associated with religious significance rather than aromatic appeal. Crushed bones from saints, soil from holy sites, and water that had been blessed by high-ranking church officials were combined with traditional perfume bases to create scents that would demonstrate the wearer's spiritual priorities, while enhancing their commitment to physical corruption. Medieval perfumers became some of the most influential figures in European courts, wielding power comparable to military advisors or financial ministers because their products could make or break political careers. A nobleman's perfumer had access to intimate details about their client's body chemistry, personal habits, and social ambitions, making them valuable sources of intelligence and potential threats to their employers' reputations. The complexity of medieval perfume formulations rivaled modern chemistry in their sophistication, but the goals were completely inverted from contemporary standards. Instead of creating pleasant scents, medieval perfumers were engineering olfactory experiences that would communicate complex social and religious messages to educated audiences while repelling common people who lacked the cultural knowledge to appreciate aristocratic stench. These perfumes were applied to unwashed bodies, using techniques that required years of training to master properly. The goal wasn't to cover natural odors, but to create harmonious blends where artificial scents would complement and enhance the wearer's accumulated filth, producing signature aromas that could be identified from considerable distances by those familiar with court protocols. The application process itself became a form of court entertainment, with perfuming ceremonies that could last for hours and involved dozens of servants working with specialized tools to achieve the perfect balance of natural and artificial odors. These events were attended by other nobles who would offer commentary and criticism on the artistic merits of different scent combinations, treating the enhancement of human stench as a legitimate art form worthy of serious aesthetic consideration. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of medieval anti-bathing culture was how it affected the treatment of women, who faced additional restrictions and expectations around their rejection of cleanliness. Female nobles were expected to demonstrate their virtue and spiritual commitment through even more extreme avoidance of hygiene than their male counterparts, since women were considered naturally more susceptible to the temptations of vanity and bodily pleasure. Medieval women's fashion was specifically designed to accommodate and enhance systematic filthiness, with layers of heavy fabrics that would trap body odors and absorb bodily fluids, while preventing any accidental cleansing that might occur from contact with water or other cleaning agents. The most expensive women's clothing was treated with special chemicals that would repel water and prevent washing, ensuring that aristocratic ladies could maintain their commitment to holy dirtiness even in adverse weather conditions. The elaborate headdresses and veils worn by medieval noblewomen served multiple purposes related to their systematic uncleanliness. These accessories helped contain and concentrate the odors emanating from unwashed hair and scalps, while also providing visual barriers that prevented observers from seeing the full extent of accumulated grime on their faces and necks. The most fashionable headdresses included special chambers that could be filled with aromatic substances, designed to enhance rather than mask the natural smells of unwashed hair. Medieval women's beauty treatments were based entirely on the principle of enhancing natural corruption, while avoiding any practices that might accidentally result in cleanliness. Instead of soap and water, aristocratic ladies used mixtures of animal fat, crushed insects, and various organic materials that would add layers of artificial filth to their existing accumulation of natural grime. These beauty treatments were administered by specialists who had trained for years to master the complex techniques required to enhance feminine filthiness without accidentally achieving cleanliness. The process involved applying multiple layers of different substances in specific sequences, with waiting periods between applications to allow proper absorption and chemical reactions that would create permanent bonds between artificial and natural dirt. The most expensive beauty treatments incorporated rare ingredients that had been blessed by church officials or contaminated by contact with holy relics, adding spiritual significance to the physical corruption they produced. Women who could afford these religiously enhanced beauty products were considered more virtuous and spiritually advanced than those who relied on simple natural filth, creating additional layers of social hierarchy based on the sophistication of different approaches to avoiding cleanliness. But the medieval period's most extreme experiments in systematic uncleanliness occurred in the monasteries and convents that served as laboratories for testing the limits of human tolerance for filth. Religious communities competed with each other to achieve the most impressive levels of accumulated grime, treating physical corruption as a form of spiritual discipline that demonstrated their commitment to rejecting worldly pleasures. The most dedicated religious communities developed elaborate rituals around their avoidance of cleanliness, creating ceremonies that could last for days and involve the systematic application of additional dirt and refuse to bodies that were already saturated with years of accumulated filth. These rituals were attended by pilgrims who traveled from across Europe to witness demonstrations of holy uncleanliness that were considered miraculous evidence of divine favor. The participants in these extreme cleanliness avoidance ceremonies often died from infections and diseases that were directly caused by their systematic self-neglect, but their deaths were celebrated as martyrdom and evidence of their successful achievement of spiritual purity through physical corruption. The bodies of these holy individuals were preserved as relics and distributed to churches throughout Europe, where they were venerated as examples of perfect devotion to God's will. The medical consequences of medieval Europe's war against hygiene were catastrophic, on a scale that's difficult to comprehend from a modern perspective. Entire populations suffered from diseases that could have been prevented with basic washing, but these illnesses were interpreted as tests of faith or punishments for insufficient devotion, rather than natural consequences of systematic uncleanliness. Medieval physicians had developed elaborate theories to explain why their patients were constantly sick, despite following medical advice to avoid bathing and maintain maximum filthiness. These explanations involved complex interactions between humors, celestial influences, and moral factors that required extensive education to understand properly. Creating a professional class of medical experts whose primary qualification was their ability to rationalize obviously harmful practices. The economic impact of medieval anti-bathing culture was enormous, creating entire industries dedicated to managing the consequences of systematic filthiness while maintaining the cultural commitment to avoiding actual cleanliness. Perfume makers, clothing manufacturers, and medical professionals all benefited from a system that created problems it simultaneously refused to solve through obvious means. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of medieval Europe's rejection of hygiene was psychological, creating cultural associations between cleanliness and moral corruption that would persist long after the religious and medical justifications had been abandoned. The idea that excessive attention to physical appearance was spiritually dangerous became so deeply embedded in European culture that it influenced attitudes toward hygiene for centuries after the medieval period had ended. This psychological legacy would shape the development of Renaissance and early modern European society in ways that are still visible today, demonstrating how powerful cultural beliefs about cleanliness and corruption can become when they're supported by religious authority and medical expertise. The medieval period's systematic war against hygiene represents one of history's most successful examples of institutional misinformation, showing how entire civilizations can be convinced to adopt obviously harmful practices when those practices are presented as morally and scientifically superior to common sense alternatives. The transition away from medieval anti-bathing culture would prove to be just as complex and problematic as its original implementation, requiring centuries of gradual change and creating new forms of systematic uncleanliness that would make the medieval period's approach to hygiene look almost reasonable by comparison. The Renaissance courts that emerged from medieval Europe would develop their own twisted relationships with cleanliness that combined the worst aspects of Roman aristocratic pretension with medieval religious guilt, creating new forms of systematic filthiness that were even more dangerous and absurd than their predecessors.